I'm going to tell you something I have never said out loud, not even to the English counselor who has heard most of it. The whole of what I was taught about being a wife, before I became one, fit into 7 words. 7. I counted them later, far from Gordonville, and could not believe a life had been built on so few. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I say the things that were never supposed to leave the kitchen. Before I give you those 7 words, and I will give them to you, every one, exactly as my mother said them the week before my wedding, I need you to understand the silence they came out of. Among the old order, a girl is not prepared for her wedding night. She is yielded toward it. There is no word given to her for her own body, no honest sentence from a single grown woman who has already walked through it. What there is instead is Gelassenheit, the yieldedness meant to carry you, and an Ordnung that decided long ago what a wife is for. I went into the most disorienting night of my life with nothing in my hands but those 7 words. I will get to that table, I promise you. But first I have to show you the house. If you are still here, stay with me. Don't subscribe for me. Do it so the next girl with no one to tell her the truth finds a voice that is not lying to her. And tell me, wherever you are tonight, what were the only words you were given before they handed you a life? Were you taught a no was a sin? Add your voice so someone younger hears it landed somewhere. There was a cedar chest at the foot of my bed for as long as I can remember, and into it, from the time I was a small girl, I was sewn. That is the only way I know how to say it. My mother Mary taught me to quilt and to hem and to embroider my initials in plain thread before I was 10 years old, and everything my hands made that was good enough went into that chest. Pillowcases, a double wedding ring quilt in blue and cream, the only fancy thing a plain woman was permitted to make, and even then only because it was for a marriage. Dish towels, a nightgown. The chest smelled of cedar and of the lavender sachet my grandmother had tucked in the corner of it before I was born, and when you lifted the lid, the smell came up at you like a held breath. I did not understand, as a child, what I was filling it for. I only knew that a good girl filled it, and that the fuller it got, the closer I was to something everyone around me seemed glad about, and no one explained. On winter evenings, my mother would lift the lid and check the stitching of what I had made, holding it to the kerosene lamp, and her approval of a straight seam was the warmest thing I knew how to earn. I learned early that I was loved best when I was useful and quiet and adding to that chest. We did not call it a hope chest in our house. My mother called it the Aussteier, the dowry, the things a bride brings, and I want you to hear what that word does. It made me, from the age of 7 or 8, a thing that was being assembled, not a girl growing into herself, a bride being stalked, piece by piece, the way you put up 48 quarts of tomatoes in an afternoon so the cellar is ready before the winter you know is coming. I was the useful daughter. That is its own word in our world, though we never said it out loud either. By the time I was 12, I could run a kitchen for a harvest crew, can a garden's worth of beans, mind 4 younger ones, and scrub a Monday wash through the wringer washer my father built with his own hands. My worth was my usefulness, and my usefulness was practice for a house that was not yet mine. Every skill I learned twice, once for my mother's kitchen, and once, secretly, understood by everyone, for the kitchen I would keep for a husband I had not yet been told the name of. A good girl was demütig, low, quiet, useful, unnoticed. I was very, very good. I watched the girls just ahead of me go. That is how you learned what was coming for you in our Jime, you watched the line. A girl 2 years older married in the wedding season after harvest, and then the one a year older, and you understood without anyone sitting you down that the chest at the foot of your bed was a countdown. Nobody told me I would marry Jonas Lapp. I knew it the way you know the frost is coming, by the slant of the light. His family farmed 3 places over. He came home from the singings in his courting buggy and sat in our front room on 2 chaperoned visits, fully clothed and nearly silent, and he spoke to my father before he ever truly spoke to me, and the dress went into the chest. A dark blue wedding dress, made by my own hands and my mother's together, no buttons, because buttons were too proud, fastened with straight pins like every dress I had ever worn. We folded it in tissue and laid it on top of everything else I had made, and my mother smoothed it flat with her hand twice, the way she smoothed everything she could not say anything about. I was 18. I had been baptized that summer, kneeling on a church Sunday, taking the vow of obedience to God, and the Ordnung that I did not fully understand was also the lock on the door behind me. You cannot be shunned from a church you never joined. I joined, and then I went home and folded my wedding dress into a cedar chest and waited to be a wife, with no more idea of what that meant than the lavender in the corner had. There were 3 silences I was raised inside, and I did not have a name for any of them until I was 26 years old. I am going to tell you all 3, because the 7 words my mother gave me were only the last and smallest room in a house made entirely of them. The first silence was the silence around my own body. I want to be careful here, because I am not going to be crude, and the people who raised me were not crude either. It was the opposite of crude. It was a vast, careful, total quiet. No grown woman in my life ever spoke to me plainly about what a woman is, what happens to a body, what a wedding night is. Not my mother, not my aunts, not the older married women I helped in the kitchen at every frolic from the time I was 12. The female body was not discussed. It was covered, long hair never once cut, wound and pinned and capped under the white cap, the dress to below the knee, dark and solid, no pattern, the straight pins felt against the skin all day long. And what is covered that completely, a girl learns, must be covered for a reason, must be dangerous, must be shameful. I reached my own wedding not innocent in some sweet way, but ignorant in a deliberate way, kept ignorant on purpose, and taught to feel that the ignorance itself was a kind of goodness. The second silence was the silence of the mothers. This is the one that took me the longest to understand, because for years I blamed my mother for it, and that was easier than the truth. The truth is that the women were the ones who carried the system into the kitchen and handed it down, and they did not do it because they were cruel. They did it sideways. Everything in my mother's world that could not be said directly was said over a basket of bread or a sink of dishes, the eyes somewhere else. There is a word for what that was, and my English counselor gave it to me slowly, the way you feed broth to someone who has not eaten in a long time. She called it inherited silence. A thing a woman cannot soften without it breaking her, so she passes it down hard, the way it was passed to her, and calls the passing down love. My mother was not withholding the truth from me out of meanness. She did not have the truth either. She had 7 words, because 7 words were all that had ever been given to her. The third silence was the silence the community kept around a wife's no. But I am getting ahead of myself, and I promised you I would not get to that table before its time. There was a woman in our district. I will not give you her real name. I will call her Lydia, because there truly was a Lydia, an old woman who stood behind the long tables at a barn raising once and told me a piece of the truth no one else would. But it is a different Lydia I want to put beside myself now. An old woman I sat next to at a quilting when I was newly engaged, her fingers brown and bent and faster at the needle than any of ours. She asked me, not unkindly, if my chest was full. I said it was, and she looked at the quilt going under our hands and she said, almost to herself, that her own mother had given her 7 words at her kitchen table the week before her wedding, in 1950-something, and that she had given her own daughters the same 7 words, and that she supposed that was just how it went. She did not say it like a complaint. She said it like the weather, and I did not understand then that I had just been handed the whole machine, turning, 3 generations of women feeding the same 7 words down the same table because not one of them had ever been given anything else to feed. She was not a villain, that old woman at the quilting frame. She was a girl once, given 7 words by a mother who had been given 7 words. The cruelty was never in the women. The cruelty was in a system that made sure the only thing a mother had to hand her daughter was her own yieldedness, wrapped up to look like wisdom. Now I will take you to the table. It was the week before the wedding. A Thursday in November was coming. At my father's farm, 300 guests, roast chicken and creamed celery and 7 kinds of pie, no rings, no music, no dancing. The dress was in the chest. The celery was already planted and pooled. You could always tell whose daughter was getting married in our settlement by who had a long row of celery in the garden, because you needed so much of it for the wedding, and that celery in the ground was a kind of announcement no one made out loud. Everything was ready. Everything except me, though I did not know yet how unready I was. My mother asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. The wood stove was ticking the way it did as it settled. There was a single kerosene lamp lit, throwing those long, soft shadows up the plain wall, and her hands smelled of the lye soap she made by hand, and I remember thinking this so clearly, I thought, this is it. This is the moment she tells me. Every girl, I believed, got this moment, where her mother finally crossed the silence and gave her what she needed to walk into her marriage. I had waited for it without knowing I was waiting. I folded my hands in my lap. I was 19 years old, and I sat very straight, and I waited to be told the truth. My mother folded her hands too. She looked at the table, not at me, and she said 7 words. Give him your body. Never refuse him. Then she stood up, and she went back to the dishes. That was the whole of it. That was the preparation. I sat there with my hands folded, waiting for the rest, for the part where she explained, where she softened it, where she told me anything at all about what those words would mean in a dark room 2 nights later. And there was no rest. There was the sound of water and the scrape of a plate. She had said the only thing she had. She had handed me, across that kitchen table, the exact same 7 words an old woman would later tell me she'd been handed in 1950-something, and I would not understand for years that my mother was not being cold. She was giving me everything she owned. It was just that what she owned was almost nothing. I am not going to tell you about the wedding night itself, because there is nothing to tell that would not be a betrayal of how little either of us knew. Jonas was 22 and I was 19, and we had been given the same nothing, from opposite sides of the same silence. He had been handed a script too. A husband leads, a wife submits, and he followed it the way he had been taught, because no one had given him another one either. There was no cruelty in that room. There was only 2 children in the dark with a dress folded in a cedar chest and 7 words between us, neither of us with any language for our own bodies or each other's, both of us certain that whatever we did not know was something we were not supposed to ask about. What there was never refuse him. I had been given a command, and under it a verb: yield. I had not been given a self that could do anything else. And so the thing that happened in that room happened the way the whole rest of my marriage would happen. Not against my will exactly, because I had never been allowed to grow a will that could be against anything. It happened in the absence of one. There is a word for that, and my counselor set it down in front of me, one careful word at a time, the way you would set down something hot. Consent, she said. That is not consent, because the person was never given the standing to refuse. I sat with that for a long time. I had thought my whole life that I had said yes. I had not said yes. I had only never been permitted to learn the shape of no. I live alone now in a small apartment in the city of Lancaster, 20 minutes and an entire world from Gordonville. I cut my own hair last spring for the first time in my life, and I cried, and then I laughed, and I am still not used to either. I see my children a few painful, supervised times a year. Levi is 6 and Annie is 4, and they are being raised, a few miles from where I sit, to understand their mother as something that was lost. I reach toward them through Jonas's sister, very carefully, a thread that may never become more than a thread. Some of what was taken does not come back. I have made my peace with grief in both directions. I mourn a family that is alive, and I am mourned, by the living, as good as dead. I kept the cedar chest. They let me take almost nothing, but it had been mine since girlhood, and somehow it came with me, and it sits in my small apartment with the same lavender smell in the corner of it, gone faint now. The wedding dress is not in it anymore. I keep other things there now, things I chose, a library card with my own name on it, a black notebook, the first things I ever owned because I wanted them and not because they readied me for someone else's life. And here is the thing I have never said out loud. The confession under the confession. A few months after I left, sitting in that apartment, I caught myself doing something with my hands and my mouth at the same time. I was folding a dish towel, and I was rehearsing. I was imagining Annie grown, Annie at her own kitchen table the week before her own wedding. And I was practicing, without meaning to, what I would tell her. And the words that came up in me, the words my own mouth was already shaping before I could stop them, they were my mother's 7 words. They were right there, loaded, ready, 3 generations deep, sitting in me like they had a home there. Give him your body. Never refuse him. I heard them in my own voice, and I put the dish towel down, and I had to hold the edge of the table. That is how it travels, not through monsters, through a tired woman folding a towel, who loves her daughter, opening her mouth to hand down the only thing she was ever given. I had walked 1,000 miles out of that world, and the silence had come with me, packed in my own throat, and it would have come out of me the way it came out of my mother, and out of Lydia's mother, and out of every mother back up that line, if I had not, by the grace of one English woman's question at a produce stand, learned that there was anything else a body could be handed. So I am going to tell Annie something else, if I am ever given the chance. I am going to sit her down and look at her, not at the table, and I am going to say it to her face. Your no is a whole sentence. It always was. You do not owe your yes to anyone, and your body was never the dowry in a cedar chest, never a thing being assembled for someone else. It was always, every single day of your life, yours. If you were ever handed a few words and told that was all the truth you would get, I see you. If you ever sat at a table with your hands folded, waiting for your mother to cross the silence, and she could not, because no one had ever crossed it for her, I see you. If you walked into the most frightening night of your young life with nothing but a verb and the certainty that asking was a sin, I see you. And if you have ever caught your own mother's words rising in your own throat, ready to be handed down, and stopped them there, then you already know the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to pass on the silence she was raised in. They taught me that being good meant making myself smaller until there was nothing left of me to refuse with. It took me 26 years and one stranger's question to learn that the smallness was never goodness. It was just the silence, wearing goodness like a borrowed dress. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.